Well, we're on our final chapter, and they saved the best for the last, in a sense, which is the gender of politics and power. And, of all the chapters in the book, this one gets you on both the personal level and the social level, from the micro to the macro, because it's woven in our lives, in our culture, especially at this point in time, the kind of violence and anger and expressions of power that we see are I was going to say are pretty powerful, but they are. So, one of the main learning goals for this chapter is to understand how gender helps determine who has power and who doesn't. And, once again, at the personal level and at the structural level. So I've put up some pretty powerful videos for you this week to understand that, like the videos of the man who went around punching women in the face in New York City for no reason. There's that just happened a month or two ago. There's a couple of other ones that are pretty intense too. So first, what we should do is define power, and how the way sociologists define power is the ability of some actors to influence the behavior of others, whether through persuasion, authority, or coercion. So we're going to look at coercion uh, deeply in here. Coercion is another word for force, right? Okay. And persuasion, you don't need, that's talking somebody into something. So here's some questions to ask. Where and when do people acquire power? And are there different methods that are open to women and men? And the answer to that is yes, of course. And I'm sure you by now, if you didn't already know that you do after, this whole term of discussing this. So another thing to think about and to discuss, question to ask is, how are issues like sexual assault and sexual harassment aspects of power relationship? Well, the quick and simple answer to that is it's the person with the most power who's the perpetrator, right? The person who's the victim, doesn't have the power to be a perpetrator. Another question is, how do power and gender operate in many institutions in our lives? And it's virtually all the institutions in our lives where those are important issues. And are certain types of governments more conducive to gender equality than others? And I put up a very short video about Finland for an example, because the Scandinavian countries do the best with this pretty much. In the you know Anglo-European nations, they do. And in Finland, their president, I don't know if she's still president, but as of a couple of years ago, when I first put up a video about her, she's like 30 years old, and she's like their president. She's the prime minister. And then the two next positions under her, most powerful positions, are both young women. So you can take a look at that. So first, let's look at power, both good and bad. And you know this quote, I'm sure. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You hear people saying that all the time. I want you to understand that that statement refers to absolute power. Okay, that's different than democratic power. So, absolute power in that refers to monarchs and dictatorships, things of that nature. So, the quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. First, we need to think about the different kinds of power, and I just described a little bit of that to you. So, they refer a lot in this section in the text, or the author does, to supervillains. And so you're going to hear that terminology used a lot, thinking about the kind of power that supervillains have. So that kind of power, the kind of power sought by supervillains, like dictators, for instance, and some of the supervillains in films, and that's what inspired the quote. So the quote refers to coercive power. And that's the ability to impose one's will by force, threats, and deceit. So, once again, this is about force, coercion. If you think that people have power over you, okay, it's very unlikely, if you think about the people who have power over you, that you're thinking of people like supervillains and dictators, because many of the people who have power over you are people that you love and trust. And the example for your parents, for instance, legally have power over you till you reach a certain age, okay? And so that coercive power, when you hear the word power, what people think of immediately is, coercive power and force and, laws and dictators and all that kind of stuff. They rarely think about, you know, their parents and their teachers. Flight attendants have power over you, right? There are rules you have to follow. A soccer game official or any sporting event official has power over you, but that's not coercive power, okay? Um, so the kind of, those kinds of power, that kind of power that parents and soccer officials have uh, is called legitimate, institutional power, legitimate power, or authority. That's the shorthand for it. So that's the power that comes from an organization or an institution or laws, and that's considered legitimate power. Authority is also called institutionalized power because it's derived from the strength of an institution. And, the three branches of government is an example of that. Um, so to begin with, we're going to look at coercive power, and the other word for that is force, as it relates to gender and what those consequences are of it. Okay. So by learning about, some of the most very problematic questions about gender and power in general, and that's how we're going to investigate this issue. Okay. So, as I said, remember that first, that coercive power is the ability to influence others through the use of force, threat, or deceit. What's deceit? It's lying to you. Okay. Bear that in mind. That an authority figure telling lies is so. Since this is a class on gender, as you know, we're going to start with masculinity and power. That's how we're going to begin. So the original quote about power, which was shortened to absolute power corrupts absolutely, but the original quote was power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. Okay, so I want to remind you, first of all, that great men are almost always bad men, that there's that almost always in there. That doesn't mean that all great men are bad men, but a large percentage of them tend to be. Okay. So the first thing to notice about that quote is that it's exclusively referring to men. And the man who made the quote in 1887 was named Lord Acton. And so he was seeing in 1887 what was going on in England and power. Okay. So there were some pushes against that type of power. The suffrage movement at that time had begun in England, which was the women's right to vote movement, and it had begun more than 20 years earlier than Acton actually made that quote, which was very close to 1900, as you know, in 1887. Queen Victoria, there was a woman on the throne. Queen Victoria was the monarch at that time in England, and she'd been that monarch for 50 years at the point that he made that quote. And so most likely when he used the term men, he was referring to humanity, which was the common way you referred to all humans for a long time. So even with the history of Queen Elizabeth I, who was also queen for almost 50 years, And Victoria in 1887, the assumption was in the matters of real power, in which are the areas of politics and the economy. Those are two of the most important places to have power, okay? In those two areas, politics and the economy, they were exclusively male. And at that point in time, in England and in the United States, women couldn't vote. So whoever was in power was voted. They were men and they were voted into office by men, into positions of power. So for the Victorians, the masculinity was equated with the possession of power. And, that's it has continued to be, masculinity has continued to be equated and associated with positions of power. Another way to think about this is to examine whether having power is an integral part of what it means to be masculine. And I think at this point in the term, that it is socially constructed as being an integral part of what it means to be masculine, to have power, but that all men do not have equal power. So, does being a man mean having access to power in ways that women don't? And in a very broad, general sense, yes, it does. The answer seems to be yes. So in institutionalized power, if we look at institutionalized power, legitimate power, remember, the amount of power women have fluctuates over time and cultures, as you might imagine. But even in the most egalitarian societies, where women have lots of power, men seem to have more, even if it's a little bit more, from the anthropological and sociological research. So that's an interesting point. But for the most part, even in the societies where women have much more power than they do in many other societies, some sub-Saharan African cultures, as we talked about earlier, women have lots of power, especially economic power. And many Native American cultures, women had a fair amount of power. But for the most part, in most cultures, it's men who make and enforce laws and rule governments. So it's men who make and enforce the laws, who rule governments, start and wage wars. I don't know of any wars that were started by women. Maybe you do, but I can't think of any offhand. They interpret for others the word of God. That's mostly men and has been exclusively men and still is in the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. And accumulate wealth. It's mostly men who accumulate wealth. Most wealthy women in the world have been women who either married into wealth or who were born into a family of wealth. It was not wealth that they made themselves, generally. Okay. So, as we said, although across time there have been places where some women had the power to do these things, they've never done so consistently over time or in a great number, same number as men have. So today, as in the past on a global scale, men have more control in courtrooms, corporate boardrooms, computer labs, medical labs and centers, university classrooms, those types of things. Decisions generally in those kinds of environments are made by men who are usually white, upper or middle class, and heterosexual, whether that's CEOs of large corporations, elected officials, religious leaders, whatever position they may hold, they have the power to affect many aspects of our lives, as you can think of that. CEOs of large corporations, elected officials, religious leaders. Those people all have a lot of power to affect certain aspects of our lives. For example, currently, marriage, who is allowed to get married? Okay. Abortion, birth control, just in current debates, okay, and the possibility and the reality of laws changing. That's a lot of power that a lot of men have. Okay. And those men, for the most part, are not considered to be supervillains, for the most part, even though they have that much power. And many men say this is an interesting conundrum, and we're going to look at it. While we see that all this power is concentrated with men, there's many men who don't feel that they have much power at all. And as I said, that's a puzzle. It's a conundrum, but it's not a plot and it's not a ploy. Whatever we determine that is, that generally men have an enormous amount of power, but many men on a personal level, remember we were going to look at the personal and the structural level, don't feel like they have much power. We're left with that fact that although across many different societies men are quite powerful, certainly more so than women, many individual men feel fairly powerless. So how do we explain that? How does social science explain that? So really, who really has the power? Well, remember our discussion in a previous chapter about hegemonic masculinity that comes up over and over, doesn't it, in every chapter? And that's because it's so important to understanding masculinity and what the reality of many men have to, struggle with to fit into that mold of expected masculinity. So the answer of who really has the power and hegemonic masculinity is the way masculinity works, both as a social system and as an identity. Because hegemonic masculinity is the standard against which men are judged, although very few men actually meet the ideals of it. It's mostly white, middle class again, younger, heterosexual, middle and upper class, I would say, younger heterosexual men, which already who beat those qualifications. That already tells us that power is not equally distributed among all men, because some men, as we discussed in earlier chapters, don't have equal access to the power of masculinity, like men of color, for instance, working class men. Remember the working class buffoons in the chapter on the media, and gay, bisexual, and transgender men. None of those men have equal access to the dynamics of power that white, upper, and middle class heterosexual men have, who went to the best colleges like Yale and Harvard, who have inherited wealth, who have access to resources that other men don't have. But nonetheless, okay, even though these other men don't have the same resources, the hegemonic definition of manhood, or what it means to be masculine, is, as Michael Kimmel says, we're going to talk about him a lot now, a man in power, a man with power, and a man of power. That is the translation of hegemonic masculinity. Always have to be in power. You always have to have the control of the situation. So Kimmel argues that this power is shown by men attempting to demonstrate this particular definition of manhood. That's a tough definition to meet, right? Always in power, of power, have power, right? They must exert, here's the reason, because they have to exert power over not only actual women, but over themselves. Any female characteristics or feminine characteristics in themselves, like, oh gosh, empathy, showing real, true affection for their children, those type, or their friends, their male friends, okay? Those are considered female characteristics. So, those have to be policed and patrolled in the individual man by himself very carefully. So although the primary displays of masculinity are directed at other men, they also must avoid even the slightest. So you're doing this performance for other men from this hegemonic masculinity perspective. Okay, you're performing to be in power all the time and be strong and all of that kind of thing, right? And that's directed at other men, not at women, proving to other men that you're a true male in the sense that we, think of it or define it. Okay. But at the same time you're doing this display to other men, you have to avoid even the slightest indication of affection or concern for other men because masculinity is inevitably associated with heterosexuality. So if you have to be very careful that you don't display too much affection for your best friend or something of that nature. Because in this model, this hegemonic model of masculinity, to be homosexual makes real manhood impossible. So anything that can be interpreted, as possibly being homosexual, which is once again, being a little bit more feeling and softer, more emotional, possibly. So the next, therefore, is that homophobia, the hatred of homosexuals or homosexuality, is essential to real manhood. As Kimmel points out, probably the very worst accusation for many young boys in the United States is to be called a sissy, which some of you are probably very familiar with, and the pain that that can cause. Because of this, Kimmel argued, most men spend their lives avoiding any form of emasculation, which is, the taking away or reducing of perceived masculinity. So they spend most of their lives avoiding that, either by women or by other men. And since they're engaged in this game of, constantly defending themselves against that emasculation, it's inevitable, and this is the truly sad and unfortunate part of this. In that constant defense of masculinity, it's inevitable that violence and the willingness to fight are often seen as key markers of manhood. The willingness and ability to use violence becomes for many men, and in many subcultures, think of the gang subculture, a way in which to prove their manhood. In many gangs, taking a beating is a rite of passage, and killing someone is a rite of passage. So, this perspective on masculinity as an identity helps us to understand why individual men might not feel very powerful, especially if they have to constantly prove their masculinity, their manhoods. And in that, they're often being coerced by other men, forced by other men, those in power, to do that. It's not verbal, it's not stated. You have to understand that. It's a dynamic that occurs. And I wanted to tell you about a young athlete, student that I had many years ago at SWAC. And he was a young black man. He was from Hunters Point in San Francisco, which is an urban, very tough urban inner city ghetto. And he kept getting phone calls from his brothers and uncles and friends to come down back to San Francisco and take on the man that his mother was living with because he was beating her and abusing her. And he talked to me about it. He came to my office a few times and told me what was going on. And he said something I will never forget. He said, "Every time I go home, they put a gun in my hand." And he went home for Thanksgiving break and never came back to school. So I don't know what happened to him. But that is what they're talking about here in this part of the book, this having to prove manhood constantly. And depending on the culture you're in or the subculture, it can be pretty violent. So that's the contradiction that's connected to the sociological dynamic we learned about in an earlier chapter, the difference between private troubles and public issues. because our experiences as individuals and what's expected of the social structure that we live in are a dynamic, that interact with one another. So it's really important here at this point to understand that one of the most powerful and revolutionary aspects of the second wave of the women's movement, so that was the one that happened in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s, through the 70s actually, was that feminists began to make just those connections. The connections between their private troubles and public issues, i.e., public policies in many cases. And that's where the wonderful and such meaningful saying, the personal is political, came out of that second wave of feminism. Think about that. The personal is political. What happens to you, and once it is based in the political, what happens in your personal life. So once again, think about what's going on with abortion and birth control right now. And you see how the personal is political. So for women, and that's why it came out of the women's movement, for women, this is a more obvious connection, right, between private lives and public issues, as I just said. Abortion, for example, was legalized out of that second wave of feminism in 1972 or 73. It was legalized as a consequence of that second wave of feminism. Or being able to keep your children after divorce was another example that came out of that. So feminists often focus how women as a group don't have power in the actual structures of society. But also, as individuals, women often face, powerlessness in their personal lives as well. So, for example, sexual assault happens disproportionately, as I'm sure you know, to women. And the fear of rape is one many women experience. And depending on where you live and what your situation is, some experience that daily, that fear of rape. So structurally, that's the personal, that fear of sexual assault and rape. Structurally, the fear is often reinforced by law enforcement, by the way they treat and respond to cases of sexual assault and rape. Historically, they didn't respond, particularly to husbands assaulting wives. I mean, the police would just maybe give the guy a brief talking to or something, but there were, they didn't arrest him or do anything until, the second wave of feminism, till the 70s, and laws changed, late 70s, okay? So therefore, the rate of punishment and, convictions is quite low, actually, for sexual assault compared to the number that are perpetrated. So there's another example of the clear connection between the lack of power experienced by women individually through the fear of sexual assault, and as a group, the lack of power to design and enforce the punishments and the laws. Because unless women are elected to office and are lawmakers, that's why they're called lawmakers, they don't have any input into how the laws are designed or created. So the connection between the lack of power in private lives and the public sphere as well is not as true for men. It's there, but it's not as true. And here's why. Research shows that men as a group do have more power at a societal level. But once again, we're getting to this puzzle again. Many men as individuals certainly don't feel especially powerful. But in the 1970s, at the same time that the second wave of feminism was happening, there was a men's movement. And your author's speaks kind of derogatorily of the men's movement and thinking it was just like a return to a warrior idea of manhood, but it really wasn't. It was mythopoetic. It was based on myth. Robert Bly, who was a leader of it, was a poet. He's dead now, but he was a very famous poet. So it wasn't the kind of warrior behavior where you go out and you bonk people on the head and kill a bunch of animals. It was a warrior of having that strength within, that kind of energy of, as they called it, deep manhood. And So that also would mean being a warrior enough to protect weaker people like women and children rather than assaulting them. Okay. So some of the men in the movement, who were the leaders of the movement, used a metaphor to explain why many individual men feel powerless, even though it's a fact that men have more power in the culture than women. So here it is. It's the chauffeur metaphor. So from the outside, just looking at the guy in the car, the chauffeur seems to be in command. He has a uniform, he's driving a car, he knows where he's going. Okay. But in reality, the chauffeur, who's a man, is taking directions from someone who's a man, much more powerful than he is. And he's not really in charge at all, the chauffeur. So if you use that metaphor, uh, although feminists and many women and a lot of men looking from the outside, think men have all the power, are all powerful. In reality, most men are just following directions from someone else. So now, this is an interesting question. Who exactly has the power? Who's giving the directions? Who's the guy sitting in the back of the chauffeur-driven car? Who's paying the chauffeur, and telling him where to go? Well, the men's movement didn't really give any deep answers to that, but they used a metaphor to emphasize the actual individual experiences of men. They used that chauffeur metaphor. So, because individually, men may feel bossed around by their wives, by their children, their bosses, the government. That's just some of the possibilities that they're getting bossed around by people. And Michael Kimmel pointed out that in reality, although they may be angry at their wives and their children, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in reality, the person giving the orders is most often another man. Okay? So, in other words, the powerlessness is real and actually felt by men, but it's a product of the relations between men. Rather than being taken away from men as a group in the social structure. So men think it's the social structure or their personal lives or whatever that's taking their power away, but in reality, it's other men, the uber men, the ones who are in charge and control things. So some men have more or less power than other men. We know that. And some men have more access to the power that men have as a group. And this is where that kind of larger political power, sometimes coercive power, comes in. So, for example, a working class man usually has less power than many of the middle class and upper class men that he encounters, like his boss, doctors, landlords, bankers, not bakers, his landlords, bankers, teachers, law enforcement officials, okay? He has less power than them, the man, the common man, the working class man, not the highly educated man, okay? These men have much more power than him, but they're still mostly men. So the power struggles stay within groups of men, okay? That's a very important point. So to conclude that the solution to feelings of powerlessness, of individual men, to conclude that those feelings of individual men and powerlessness is to give men more power, is simply not understanding the dynamics of power relations and how they're arranged. Okay. And finally, Michael Kimmel concluded that most men feel powerless, and this is such an important point. And it can break your heart if you really think about this deeply. Kimmel says that most men feel powerless because of the way masculinity is constructed as an identity. Because those ideals are so difficult to achieve and so narrowly defined that few men ever succeed in completely, feeling completely and securely like a man and therefore powerful. Some men who are not white, middle class, young, and heterosexual are less likely to feel masculine as it's socially constructed and therefore less powerful. And if Kimmel is correct, that at least in the US, and this is a quote from him, masculinity has become a relentless test by which we prove to other men and to women, and ultimately to ourselves as men, that we have successfully mastered the part of being masculine. Then how many men, if that's what it is involved in being masculine and accepted completely and not, and, in having to prove yourself to be that all the time, how many men actually feel like they've ever passed the manhood test? And I do want to say that I have two daughters and a son. They're all, grown up now, of course, and parents of their own. But I remember the struggles that my son had with a lot of this, and it's difficult. It is difficult. Men may have more power on the whole than women, but in the end, it's not such a great experience, even having that power. You have to give up a lot of human connection to have that kind of power. So now we're back to the superheroes and the villains. In reality, men may actually be closer to superheroes. This is interesting, especially in the modern versions of them, when being one never seems what everything it's supposed to be or cracked up to be, right? Because in modern day superhero stories, like Spider-Man, you never get the girl, and you might get chased by the cops or perceived as the bad guy. You actually have to hide the fact that you're a superhero. So the power that men possess comes with a great burden. That's what I went referring to what watching my son grow up into manhood. It is that great burden of having to constantly prove your masculinity. So it's that great burden, which is an important point to keep in mind of what men go through with that as we move through the rest of this chapter. So let's dig deeper now into the meaning and effects of coercive power. As we've talked about, it's the ability to influence others through the use of force, threats, or deceit. So a lot of coercive power in gender relations takes the form of violence or the threat of violence. And as I said, there's several videos I put up that are real things happening, not, and not just people talking, that were filmed that you can see. So some feminists say that coercive power is the building block of all other kinds of gender power. That's the basis of it, is coercive power. Because as we know, men are more likely to commit acts of violence against women and against other men as well. And this fact affects all relations between women and men, and it permeates many institutions of our society as well. So in many societies, including in the United States, the willingness and ability to use violence is a sure way to gain power. And according to this perspective, it is the very basis and the primary source of power for men. And we're seeing the kind of coming out of that again today, aren't we? The willingness and ability to use violence, okay, to gain power. In the US, it's verifiably true that men are more responsible for violence in many forms it takes. I know this may be difficult for many of you men in the class to hear these statistics if you don't know them already, but I can assure you that they're real. These first that I'm going to quote are from the FBI. So they Men make up 79% of those who are arrested for violent crime in the United States. And they are 97% of those arrested for rape, 77% for aggravated assault, 84% for robbery, and 71% for disorderly conduct. And this is a really scary one. 89% of female murder victims are killed by men. So beginning with the second wave of the feminist movement, that's when many of these laws changed in the late 60s, 70s, into the 80s, early 80s. Many of the laws that were specifically gendered were for the first time identified and perceived as crimes. Because previously, many of them were not seen as particularly wrong, as I mentioned, let alone criminal. And I mentioned that one about men physically attacking their wives. As recently as the 1960s in the United States, for example, women who were not virgins could not legally accuse a man of raping them. Now, that's pretty amazing when you stop and think about that. I'm going to repeat that. As recently as the 1950s in the United States, women who were not virgins could not legally accuse a man of raping them. And marital rape that occurred within marriage, did not become illegal in the United States until 1976. Until 1976, rape laws had a marital exclusion because legally, until then, marriage gave husbands the right to have sex with their wives whenever they chose, regardless of the wife's consent. So before the second wave of feminism in many places in the world, there was no such thing as domestic violence. There was not a term called domestic violence because people didn't even have a concept of it. There were no such thing as domestic violence, wife battering, or sexual harassment. Those things were happening. They just weren't named, nor were they illegal. In the United States, husbands beating their wives was not treated seriously. As I said, the cops would just, if they got a call, they'd come and they'd just talk to the guy and calm him down a little bit. They were not seen as crime until the women's movement, the second wave. And then there were these amazingly awful head and master laws, they were called, were enforced. And the almost complete control of husbands over wives until the 60s and 70s. So therefore, assaults of husbands against wives, even parents against children, were not within the legal system. Because those head and master laws, that's what they were called. It means head of the household and master of the household. Head and master laws dictated that husbands had the final say in all household decisions and joint property, and that they could make decisions about them without their wives' knowledge or consent. And sexual harassment in the workplace emerged in the 1970s as well, because before that, sexual harassment was considered a normal and expected aspect of the workplace. Up until the 1950s, some laws in the United States made it legal. It actually made it legal to deny employment to women in general. There were, and especially to married women. Even now, the threat of sexual assault and violence still influences the decisions and opportunities of women and which kind of occupation they're going to go into, because the more traditionally male an occupation is, they've done research on this, of course, the more sexual harassment there is when women enter that. Think about the military, for example. So although it's now illegal to bar a woman from a job in a male-dominated occupation, such as law enforcement, many women generally not rushing to join law enforcement because they know how much sexual harassment they face. And so they're either driven out or they never apply. Now we're going to look at something that has a very powerful name, and it's called the geography of fear. So there are a wide range of implications, as you can imagine, and maybe you know, for living with the fear of becoming a victim of sexual assault. And that leads to something that's called the geography or landscape of fear. And that includes this being kind of hyper alert that women often have to be. Assessing the vulnerability and fear in certain spaces, uh, where you're walking or what is it dark, that type of thing. Because despite the fact that most violence against women occurs in private, inside the home, it still does, that's where the majority of it occurs, women are taught to fear and avoid the sphere of public space. This is the videos that I put up for you that happen in New York City. A woman in a public setting is vulnerable to a very wide range of impositions on her privacy and safety, from objectification to lewd comments, to physical assault, like the videos I put up. And, I remember when I lived in New York City when I was very young, man, if there was construction work going on, you generally cross the street, you know, because of the lewd comments and the cat calls and the type of thing as you walk by. So there was a study of women using a public park which demonstrated how the fear of being assaulted, raped, or harassed has very real effects on the behaviors of women, like deciding whether they can even go hiking or biking in an urban park. And the fear of what might happen can actually keep women out of public spaces. And here's an interesting point. One of the most important aspects of these studies is that they highlight the ways in which the problem of that kind of coercive power, which is violence against women, used against women, is perceived as primarily a woman's problem. And it is primarily a woman's problem. Most men don't think about all those things. Is it safe to go here or there? What time of day or night is it? Et cetera, et cetera. That's something that women deal with. Maybe some men do in some situations, but it's something women do regularly. Okay. So this perception that it's a woman's problem leaves the other side of the equation untouched. That there are people responsible for assaulting, harassing, and raping women. And it's even more problematic if we assume that women are the only ones responsible for their own safety, then we're implicitly assuming that it's just the way it is. Nothing could be done about the use of coercive power by some men against women. So colleges are beginning to address this because now they can lose some funding if they don't address it. So colleges have begun to take proactive steps to address the problem of rape on campus. These are rather shocking statistics because the Department of Justice found that 1 in every undergraduate woman will experience attempted or completed sexual assault until graduating from college or leaving for other reasons. 1 in 5, that's 20%. So Title IX, which was passed in 1972, and there's that date again, states that, this is what Title IX says, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program receiving federal financial aid. So that is, you can lose your financial aid, okay? And a school can if they don't have programs in place to address sexual assault on campus. Victims of sexual assault form what's called a protected class, and colleges must take specific steps to ensure their compliance or to lose federal funding. So that's important. And, there's a long section in this chapter on the party scene in college campuses. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And it's been studied a lot because it has very gendered implications. And that's where a lot of sexual assault occurs at parties on campus. So another violent intersection is human trafficking. And, I'm sure you're well aware that human trafficking is primarily, the majority of it is females and children. And that's in part a result of what's called the feminization of poverty. Female heads of households everywhere in the world are poorer than those, but with male heads of households. So um, there's an increasing number of women in poverty worldwide, and it makes them more vulnerable to be caught in human trafficking. Um, and women are also more likely than men to be victims of modern slavery, which is the type of labor, and then the type of labor performed in that is different according to men and women. And they're more likely to be used as domestic servants as well, all in the human trafficking larger sphere of operations. What about gender and human rights? Well, it's pretty obvious that human trafficking is wrong, but there are cultural and ideological variations in the extent to which certain behaviors are found to be wrong, and prostitution is one. You probably know that some countries have legalized prostitution, other countries have different laws that deal with it. So, one of the views with prostitution is that all prostitution is a form of slavery and should be eliminated. Another idea is that it's only forced non-consensual prostitution that should be illegal and perceived as immoral. And from that perspective, it's not the prostitution itself that demeans women, but rather the outcast status that sex workers have according to cultural norms. So, of course, this argument depends on how we define choice. So those who argue that prostitution is wrong argue that the decision on the part of women to sell sex is never really a choice in that truest sense of the word, because women are forced to become prostitutes through violence, through drug addiction, and economic pressures. And these debates get really important when they affect how governments deal with prostitution. Because most governments, including ours, target the women who provide sex rather than the men who purchase it. And as I said, different countries have different ways of dealing with that. So in Sweden, for example, the purchase of sex is illegal. It's actually the purchaser the sale of it isn't illegal in Sweden, but purchasing it is. And in Germany and Holland, it's legalized. So we're going to move on here and go to institutional power and defining gender. Okay. So who defines what gender is and how people are put in different gender categories? And here's a really important point. What rights will be available to transgender and non-binary people? Okay. So for example, in 2016, North Carolina passed a bill that required transgender people in government and public buildings to use the bathroom corresponding with the gender on their birth certificate. This was in 2016. Okay. The bill also made it illegal for cities and towns to adopt their own anti-discrimination laws to protect LGBTQ residents. Now, of course, that law, remember this was a whole state law, North Carolina passed it, created widespread outrages, and companies like PayPal canceled the offices, huge office complexes they were going to build in North Carolina, and the NBA and the NCAA moved events out of the state. And in the face of those losses of billions of dollars, North Carolina repealed the bill in 2017. So there's certainly economic power one can bring to bear on these issues. So these attacks on the rights of queer people and especially transgender youth, as we know, have not ended. They have escalated. In 2021 alone, 22 state legislatures introduced bills to ban medically identified best practices for transgender youth. And the reason that this is important, and one of the reasons we're talking about it in the context of power, is that those laws represent coercive power enacted into law. Okay, so banning bills for identified medically best practices for transgender youth is coercive power. They are forcing you. Okay? So there's been a considerable amount of research about how and why such policies have been enacted. So it's very interesting. For example, in non-sexual gender integrated settings like the workplace, then you get to identity-based ideologies. They're often used. So in many workplaces, there are policies to protect and support gender identity. But in gender segregated spaces, ideologies often come into conflict in what are called gender panics or situations in which people react strongly, frantically asserting the naturalness of male-female binary. So that's the gender segregated spaces where we've seen those gender panics are in relation to the bathroom issue, for instance, which bathroom you use. Okay. So some social scientists argue that there needs to be an extension of what, remember learning about doing gender, that there needs to be an extension of what doing gender means. Because as we've discussed, doing gender theory is a process of gender attribution. It attributes gender or sex categorization, another word for gender attribution. What gender are you? What category do you fit into? And that just happens in everyday interaction. Every time we interact with someone, we put him or her into a gender category. Unconsciously and automatically, we do this. However, policy decisions also involve making decisions about people's gender, and that's called determining gender, and that happens at 3 levels. The first is in everyday interaction. That's the doing gender we just talked about. The second is in legal cases and policy decisions. And the third is actually imaginary, when the media and other institutions and have different ideas about gender and the imagined bodies of people. So an example is that in 2019, the Supreme Court heard a case arguing that employers have the right to force employees in ways, which is coercive power, force employees in ways consistent with gender stereotypes. That is, in this particular case, an employer can force a woman to wear skirts as long as they also force a man to wear suits. And this case came up and in the Supreme Court because of the firing of a transgender woman who was wearing pants, of course, not a skirt. Okay, we're going to stop at this one and begin the next section. We're finally getting to politics, which is so important.